the curse that doomed the family Peter's tragic haunting. In this chilling retelling of Trong Tang, the haunting begins when John's family unearths an ancient spirit tied to a small shrine on their land. His brother, Peter, driven by skepticism and ambition, destroys the shrine despite warnings from a spiritual master. What follows is a series of terrifying and deadly supernatural events that tear the family apart. As the curse takes hold, loved ones succumb to mysterious deaths, their spirits seemingly trapped between worlds, seeking revenge and claiming the lives of the living. The more the family fights to escape the curse, the more they are pulled into its dark embrace. The narrative crescendos in a harrowing final act where John realizes too late that the sins of his family have doomed them all. The lingering spirits, led by Peter, now return from the dead, demand the ultimate sacrifice. Only then, through a horrifying revelation, does John come to understand that some spirits should never be disturbed, and the cost of defiance is eternal suffering. The suspense builds steadily, combining elements of dread, despair, and the inevitability of fate, with each death more brutal and inexplicable than the last. Part 1. A peaceful beginning. John's family was a picture of serenity, nestled in the quiet countryside near the Red River. Their home, an aging but sturdy structure surrounded by lush greenery, stood as a testament to generations of hard work and perseverance. The stillness of the countryside was their constant companion, with nothing but the sound of the rustling leaves and the flowing river to remind them that time was passing. It was a peaceful life, undisturbed by the chaos of the outside world, or so they thought. Michael, John's father, was a man of few words but immense pride. He owned vast stretches of land that extended far beyond what the eye could see. Each morning he would walk the property with his sons, John and Peter, the weight of responsibility sitting heavily on his shoulders. His land was his legacy, a gift to be passed down, and he took pride in every corner of it, from the fertile fields to the forgotten garden at the far edge of the property. It was in that forgotten corner where the shrine sat. No one could quite remember when or why it had been built, but it had been there for as long as Michael could recall. Overgrown with moss and vines, the small structure was made of stone weathered by years of rain, sun and wind. The shrine was small, hardly noticeable unless you knew where to look. It had become part of the landscape, a fixture in the garden, much like the towering trees that had taken root around it. No one questioned its existence, nor did anyone visit it. That is, until Peter, the younger of Michael's two sons, returned home. Peter had been living in the city, building a life away from the rural quiet of his childhood. But after a bitter divorce left him with nothing, he returned to his family's land, looking for solace and a fresh start. His presence disturbed the delicate balance of the household. Where John had remained content to work the land and live quietly, Peter's return was a storm waiting to unleash. That Peter began one evening over dinner, his tone casual but insistent. "I've been thinking, I want to build a house here, on the property." Michael looked up from his plate, his face shadowed with uncertainty. "Where would you want to build? There's plenty of land," Peter replied, gesturing toward the garden. "That old patch of land by the river would be perfect." John, sitting silently at the table, felt a cold unease creep into his gut. He knew the land Peter was talking about. It was where the shrine stood. His father had never been one for superstitions, but the shrine had always been treated with a quiet respect, left untouched for generations. Michael wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, leaning back in his chair, deep in thought. "That's the land with the old shrine, isn't it?" Peter waved his hand dismissively. "It's just a crumbling old pile of rocks, Dad. I'll move it, no big deal." "No big deal," Michael repeated the words, but they felt heavy in his mouth. There was something about the shrine that gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. His father had always told him never to disturb it, but he had never explained why. It was a tradition, a relic of the past, and perhaps Michael had grown too modern to care for such things. But still, the unease lingered. John shifted in his seat, hesitant to speak but unable to hold his tongue. "Maybe we should leave it alone," he offered quietly. "It's been there a long time for a reason." Peter scoffed, his eyes flashing with frustration. "It's just an old rock. Don't tell me you believe in those silly old stories. I need to build my house there. I've got nowhere else to go." The silence at the table was thick, like the tension that had been brewing since Peter's return. Michael sighed heavily. "All right," he said at last, though he felt a pang of regret as the words left his lips. "We'll move the shrine." Peter's eyes lit up with satisfaction, but John's heart sank. Something about the decision felt wrong, but it was too late to stop the tide that had already begun to pull them all in. The next morning, Michael, ever cautious, decided to consult someone who might know more about the old shrine. He didn't want to admit it, but the stories his father had told him about the shrine as a child had stuck with him, no matter how much he tried to ignore them. He sent word to a spiritual master who lived in a nearby village, an old man known for his knowledge of the unseen world and ancient traditions. When the master arrived a few days later, there was an air of solemnity about him that made Michael uneasy. The master was a tall, white man with long white hair tied back neatly. His eyes were sharp and focused, as though he could see beyond what was visible. As he stepped out of his car and looked toward the garden, his expression darkened. "This is where you plan to build?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "Yes," Michael said, pointing to the area near the old shrine. "We're thinking of moving that old structure." "It's in the way." The master's face paled. "You must not move it," he warned, his voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. "That shrine was placed there for a reason. It is the center of a powerful energy and energy that has been contained for generations. To disturb it is to invite disaster." Peter, standing nearby, rolled his eyes. "It's just a pile of rocks, old man. We're not afraid of a few old superstitions." The master's eyes flicked toward Peter, narrowing slightly. "There are forces in this world, young man, that you do not understand. Forces that do not care if you believe in them or not. They exist regardless of your ignorance, and once you disturb them, there is no turning back." Peter laughed, shaking his head. "You're all just scared of shadows." John felt a knot tighten in his chest. He believed in the power of the old ways, even if he didn't fully understand them. There was wisdom in the traditions that had been passed down through the generations. But Peter didn't care. He was reckless, desperate to start his new life, and willing to do whatever it took to get his way. Michael stood silently, torn between his sons. He didn't want to believe in the old stories, but he couldn't ignore the chill that crept up his spine every time he looked at the shrine. Still, Peter's words were like a battering ram, knocking down the last defenses of tradition. "We'll move it," Michael said at last, his voice resigned. The master sighed deeply, shaking his head. "If you do, there will be consequences," he said quietly. "I can do nothing to stop what may come. But remember my warning: once the balance is disturbed, the forces that have been contained will be free to roam." Part 2. The warning ignored. The air was thick with anticipation as the spiritual master, a man of quiet authority, stepped onto the family's land. He moved with a sense of purpose, his long robes whispering with each measured step. His presence, though understated, commanded respect. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the property. But the light did little to ease the creeping dread that seemed to settle over everyone present. Michael stood near the old shrine, his face lined with concern. John hovered nearby, his arms crossed, a pit of anxiety churning in his stomach. Peter, however, was at the heart of the gathering, his posture defiant, his jaw set in firm resolution. He was the one pushing for this, the one determined to build his new house on this patch of land. The shrine, an old relic that had been untouched for generations, was in the way, and Peter, ever the pragmatist, saw no reason to let ancient superstition dictate the future. The spiritual master, with his eyes narrowed and lips pressed into a thin line, approached the shrine with caution. He placed a hand on the weathered stone, fingers gently tracing the grooves worn into the surface over decades, maybe centuries. His silence was heavy, like the air before a storm. "This shrine," the master began, his voice low and resonant, "was placed here long ago for a reason. It holds the energy of this land, keeps it balanced. To disturb it..." Peter interrupted, his voice sharp. "It's a pile of rocks. Old traditions, nothing more. We're not living in the past anymore. I need this land to build my house." The master turned, his gaze locking onto Peter's with a weight that made even the most skeptical heart skip a beat. His eyes, dark and intense, seemed to see beyond the present moment, as though he could peer into the very fabric of the future itself. When he spoke again, his words were slow, deliberate, and filled with a gravity that silenced the murmurs of the gathering crowd. "You do not understand the forces at play here," the master said, his tone unwavering. "This shrine is not simply a structure of stone. It is the anchor for a much older, much darker energy. To move it would be to break the seal on that energy that has been contained for generations." Peter scoffed. a humorless laugh escaping his lips. He was a man of action, not of stories. "You're saying this old shrine is holding back some kind of, what, spirits?" Curses. The master's expression did not change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Yes," he said simply. "Spirits, forces that you cannot comprehend. The shrine was placed here as a shield. Without it, the land will be vulnerable to these energies, and they will not be kind to those who disturb them." Michael shifted uneasily, glancing toward the shrine with newfound apprehension. He had never been one for superstition, but the spiritual master's presence, his certainty, made him question the wisdom of what they were about to do. John, on the other hand, felt a chill run down his spine. He had always believed, in some small way, that there were things in the world that humans weren't meant to understand. This felt like one of those things. But Peter, ever the skeptic, rolled his eyes. "Look, I'm not here for a history lesson. I'm building my house here. We'll move the shrine, and everything will be fine. There's no need for all this doom and gloom." The master's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He knew when words would not reach someone, and Peter was clearly beyond listening. Instead, he turned to Michael, his expression softening slightly. "You must stop this," the master urged, his voice low. "If you value your family, your home, leave the shrine where it is. The energy that it holds back is not meant to be unleashed. It will bring misfortune upon you." Michael hesitated. He glanced at Peter, who was already looking impatient, tapping his foot against the ground. There was a weight in the decision he was about to make, a heaviness that tugged at his heart. But Peter's needs were real. He wanted to build his life again, start fresh. Could an old shrine, no matter its history, really stand in the way of that? "We're moving it," Michael said finally, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "We've made our decision," the spiritual master exhaled slowly, his disappointment palpable. "So be it," he said, stepping back from the shrine. "But remember, once it is disturbed, there will be no turning back. The curse, once set in motion, cannot be stopped." John felt a knot form in his throat, his eyes flicking from his father to the spiritual master and back again. Something about this felt deeply, profoundly wrong. But what could he do? Peter was determined, and Michael had given his blessing. There was no stopping this now. The workers arrived shortly after, their tools in hand, ready to dismantle the shrine. Peter stood over them, directing with a sense of satisfaction, eager to see progress. The first stones were lifted, their weight heavy in the hands of the men who moved them. As they worked, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of earth and something else, something metallic and sharp that seemed to cling to the air. The sky, which had been clear moments before, began to darken. Clouds gathered on the horizon, heavy and ominous, swirling like an impending storm. The workers continued, oblivious to the change in the atmosphere, but John couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Then, as the final stone of the shrine was pried loose from the earth, a hiss echoed through the stillness. A collective gasp went up from the crowd as a deadly cobra, its scales glistening like black oil, slithered out from beneath the foundation. It coiled itself, head raised, eyes gleaming with a cold, malevolent intelligence. For a moment, no one moved. The workers froze, their hands trembling, unsure of what to do. But Peter, with a reckless bravado, grabbed a shovel from one of the men and swung it with all his strength. The sharp edge connected with the snake's body, severing it in one clean strike. The snake's head hit the ground, its mouth still open in a final, silent scream. Its body twitched violently before falling still, the life draining from it in moments. "There," Peter said, tossing the shovel aside with a smirk. "No curse, just a snake." But the silence that followed was thick with unease. The workers shuffled uncomfortably, their eyes darting to the sky, where the clouds had grown darker still. The air felt heavy, like the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes watching from the shadows. The spiritual master, who had stood quietly through the entire ordeal, stepped forward once more. His expression was grave, his eyes fixed on the spot where the shrine had stood. "You have made a grave mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The curse has begun." John felt the ground shift beneath him, a tremor that wasn't physical but deeply unsettling all the same. It was as though the land itself had recoiled at the violence done to it. He glanced at Peter, who seemed unfazed, brushing dirt from his hands as though it were just another day's work. But John knew better. Something had changed, and whatever it wasn't good. The master turned to leave, his warning hanging in the air like a sentence already passed. "Prepare yourselves," he said, his voice carrying on the wind, "for what comes next will not be stopped." With that, he disappeared into the gathering storm, leaving the family to face the consequences of their actions. Part 3. The first signs of the curse. The night the shrine was disturbed, an eerie silence descended upon the land. The usual evening symphony of crickets, rustling leaves, and distant river sounds had all but disappeared, replaced by a suffocating stillness. It felt as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. But no one in the family spoke of it, not yet. John lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind restless. He could feel the shift in the air. It was a kind of stillness that wasn't peaceful but charged with something far darker, something lurking just beneath the surface. The moonlight, which normally cast soft shadows across his room, now felt harsh and unnatural, like an intruder in his home. He tried to shake the feeling, turning over, but sleep refused to come. Down the hall, Peter slept deeply, blissfully unaware of the unease that had begun to settle into the bones of the house. His day had been victorious. He had won the battle over the shrine, and nothing, not even an old man's ominous warnings, would stand in the way of his plans. To him, this was just another night. But for Michael, John's father, the weight of the decision to move the shrine sat heavily on his shoulders. He was a man of the earth, someone who respected the land and the traditions that had come before him. The spiritual master's warning had gnawed at him since the moment those words were spoken. There was something about the shrine, something that felt older than the stories, older than the land itself. And it was that night, when the winds turned sharp and the sky cloudless, that Michael first saw it. The shadow at the edge of the field. It was past midnight when Michael woke suddenly, his throat dry, his mind disoriented by a nightmare that vanished the moment his eyes opened. He sat up in bed, his heart still racing, listening to the unfamiliar silence outside. That silence pressed against his chest, tight and suffocating, and after a few moments he couldn't stand it anymore. He got out of bed, pulled on his boots, and quietly made his way to the front door, careful not to wake his wife. As he stepped outside, the cool night air greeted him, but it didn't bring the comfort it usually did. There was something wrong with the air. It felt heavy, as though it was pressing down on the land. For a moment, Michael stood still, his eyes scanning the vast fields that surrounded the house. The moon was a pale disk in the sky, casting just enough light to see the outline of the barn and the far-off cove where the shrine had once stood. His gaze lingered on that spot, the place now nothing more than a scar of churned earth and upturned stones. But something caught his attention, something moving just beyond the edge of his vision. A shadow. It was indistinct at first, little more than a blur against the darkness. But as Michael squinted, trying to focus, the figure began to take shape. It was tall, unnaturally so, and it moved in slow, deliberate steps along the edge of the field. At first he thought it might be a person, a stranger wandering onto the property, but as he watched, a deep primal fear began to coil in his chest. The figure didn't walk like a person. It glided. It was no more than a silhouette, a human shape without features, moving soundlessly. The longer Michael stared, the colder the air seemed to become, until the warmth of the house behind him felt impossibly distant. He took a step forward, instinctively drawn to the figure, but his body froze as the shadow turned toward him. Though it had no face, Michael felt its gaze settle on him like a physical weight, pressing against his skin. His heart stuttered in his chest, and for a moment he thought it might stop altogether. The figure stood motionless, watching him, waiting for him. And then, in the blink of an eye, it vanished, gone, as if it had never been there. Michael staggered back toward the house, his hands trembling as he fumbled for the door. He slammed it shut behind him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stood there for several minutes, listening, waiting for some sign that the figure was still outside. But there was nothing, only the oppressive silence that had fallen over the land. He didn't wake his family. What could he say? That he had seen a shadow, that he had felt something watching him from the fields. No, he would keep it to himself for now. But Michael knew deep down that something had changed, and whatever it was far from finished. The deaths begin. The next morning, the sun rose, and with it came the illusion of normalcy. The light chased away the lingering unease of the night, and for a brief moment, Michael almost convinced himself that what he had seen was a trick of the light, a dream carried over from his nightmare. But the illusion didn't last. It began with the cattle. By noon, 2 cows were found dead in the barn, their bodies cold and stiff. There were no visible signs of injury, no illness that could explain it. They were simply dead eyes wide open, staring blankly at nothing. The other animals refused to go near the bodies, backing away as if they could sense something unnatural had claimed their companions. Later that day, the chickens began to die. First one, then two, then five, dropping lifeless to the ground with no warning. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, half the livestock was dead, their carcasses littering the barn and field like a grotesque mosaic of death. John watched in growing horror as each animal fell, but Peter remained unfazed. It's probably just a disease, Peter said dismissively, barely glancing at the carnage. We'll call the vet in the morning. But John wasn't so sure. There was something more to this, something that went beyond the simple illness. The air had changed, grown thicker with each passing hour, and the look in the animals' eyes as they died, it wasn't the look of sickness. It was the look of fear. The duck with the red eyes. Of all the animals on the farm, there was only one that survived the first wave of deaths, a single duck. At first glance, it seemed no different from the rest. It waddled around the barnyard, its feathers a dull brown, its beady eyes watching the world with passive indifference. But as the bodies of the other animals piled up, something strange began to happen to the duck. Its eyes, once dark and unremarkable, began to glow. At first it was a faint shimmer, barely noticeable in the daylight. But as the sun set, those eyes began to shine with an unnatural light, a deep pulsating red that sent chills down John's spine every time he looked at it. The duck's behavior changed as well. It became aggressive, charging at anyone who came too close, its beak snapping at their ankles. It hissed, an almost reptilian sound, unlike anything John had ever heard from a duck before. There was an intelligence in its eyes now, something dark and calculating. One evening, as John was closing up the barn, he saw the duck standing at the far end of the yard, its glowing eyes fixed on him. For a long moment, they stared at each other, neither moving. And then, without warning, the duck took a step toward him, its wings flaring out at its sides. John backed away slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The duck followed, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it was stalking him. Just as John reached the door of the barn, the duck stopped, its head cocked to one side, watching him with those glowing red eyes. John slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. He leaned against the wood, trying to catch his breath. The image of those eyes burned into his mind. Something was very wrong. And the worst part was, he knew that the duck was only the beginning. Peter's blindness. Despite everything, the dead livestock, the shadow in the field, the duck with the glowing eyes, Peter remained determined to press forward with his plans. He refused to acknowledge the signs, brushing them off as coincidences or bad luck. Life goes on, Peter said one afternoon, standing over the patch of land where his new house was to be built. We're not stopping because of a few dead cows and some spooky stories. John wanted to argue, to tell Peter that this was more than just bad luck. He wanted to tell him about the figure in the field, about the way the animals seemed to die in terror, about the way the air felt thick with something unseen. But Peter's mind was made up. The construction crew arrived the next morning, their trucks rumbling down the dirt road, carrying with them the tools and materials to bring Peter's vision to life. The men worked tirelessly, digging the foundation and laying the groundwork for the house that would soon stand where the shrine had once been. But as the days went on, the strange occurrences only grew more frequent and more violent. Tools went missing, only to turn up in places no one had put them. Construction workers reported hearing whispers on the wind, voices that seemed to come from nowhere. One man swore he saw a shadow dart across the construction site, disappearing into the trees before he could follow it. Still, Peter pressed on, blind to the danger that was creeping closer with each passing day. John could feel it, the curse. It was no longer just a feeling in the air. It was here, in the soil, in the walls, in the very bones of the land. And it was only a matter of time before it struck again. But by the time Peter realized the truth, it would be too late. The curse, once set in motion, could not be stopped, and it was coming for all of them. Part 4. Peter's death. The construction site buzzed with activity, a stark contrast to the eerie stillness that had taken over the rest of the land. Hammering echoed through the fields, scaffolding rose where the earth had been torn apart, and Peter stood at the center of it all, surveying his future. His dream of building a house on his family's land, a symbol of his new beginning, was finally coming to fruition. But despite the sound of progress, the land itself remained uneasy. The curse now awakened had taken root, spreading unseen tendrils through the earth and the air, growing stronger with each passing day. The strange occurrences had become part of life. The glowing red eyes of the duck, the dead leaf stalk, the whispers in the wind, they were all signs, warnings, but Peter remained stubbornly blind to them. Yet something else had begun to stir within Peter, something he could not easily dismiss. It started with a fever. At first it was nothing more than a mild discomfort, a headache, a slight rise in temperature that Peter chalked up to exhaustion from overseeing the construction. He waved off the concern of his family, insisting he was fine. But by the third day, the fever had taken hold of him like a vice, wrapping itself around his body, squeezing the strength from his limbs. At night, Peter found no rest. His sleep was haunted by dark, vivid dreams, each one more terrifying than the last. He dreamed of the shrine, the stones scattered across the dirt, and of the shadowy figure that Michael had seen weeks before. In these dreams, the figure grew clearer, more defined, until finally Peter recognized the face. It was his father. The visions begin. Peter awoke one night, drenched in sweat, the dream still vivid in his mind. His father, Michael, stood before him, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes sunken into dark, lifeless pits. He wore the same clothes Peter had last seen him in, but they were tattered, hanging loosely on his withered frame, as if he had been dead for years. In the dream, Michael's voice was a low, echoing rasp, filled with accusation and bitterness. You shouldn't have moved the shrine, Peter had tried to speak, to explain, but his mouth was dry, his voice trapped in his throat. He could only stare, paralyzed by the weight of his father's gaze. You were warned, but you ignored it. Now, you'll pay for what you've done. Peter woke with a start, gasping for air, his heart hammering in his chest. The room was dark, the moonlight casting long shadows across the floor. He ran a trembling hand over his face, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread that clung to him like a second skin. It was just a dream, he told himself, just a nightmare. But deep down, Peter knew it was more than that. The dreams continued, each one more intense than the last. Michael's accusations grew sharper, his once familiar voice now twisted with malice. He appeared in every corner of Peter's mind, always watching, always waiting for the moment to strike. You'll die for this, his father had whispered in the last dream, his breath cold against Peter's ear. The land will claim you. Peter's health continued to deteriorate. The fever worsened, his body growing weaker with each passing day. His skin, once tanned from long days in the sun, had turned pale, almost grey. Dark circles formed under his eyes, and he could barely summon the energy to stand, let alone oversee the construction. Descent into madness. The visions began to bleed into Peter's waking hours. He would see his father standing in the distance, watching him from the edge of the field, or catch glimpses of his gaunt face reflected in windows and mirrors. At first, Peter tried to dismiss these as hallucinations brought on by his illness, but the visions were too real, too persistent. One afternoon, while resting in the shade of a half-built wall, Peter saw his father again. This time Michael stood only a few feet away, his hollow eyes locked onto Peter's. You're already dead, Michael said, his voice soft but filled with venom. You just don't know it yet. Peter scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding, but his legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed to the ground, the weight of his father's words crushing him. The construction workers rushed over, but Peter could barely speak, his body racked with violent shivers. The image of his father had disappeared, but the terror remained. Get a doctor, one of the workers shouted, lifting Peter into a sitting position, but Peter barely registered the words. His vision blurred, his mind drifting in and out of consciousness. In his haze, he heard the sound of hammers and saws fade, replaced by a low, persistent hum, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. It was the same sound he had heard in his dreams, the same hum that had accompanied his father's voice. The land was alive, and it was hungry. Medical desperation. The family gathered around Peter's bed that night, watching helplessly as the fever ravaged his body. The doctor, a local man who had treated the family for years, shook his head in frustration. He had seen fevers like this before, but never one that had progressed so rapidly, nor one that seemed so resistant to treatment. We've done all we can, the doctor said quietly to Michael, who stood at the foot of the bed, his face drawn with worry. There's nothing more we can do for him? Michael looked down at his son, lying pale and gaunt in the bed, his chest rising and falling with shallow, labored breaths. This was not the Peter he knew, the stubborn, headstrong man who had fought so hard to carve out his own path. This was a shell, a body being slowly drained of life by something unseen. John sat by the bedside, holding his brother's limp hand. The weight of the spiritual master's warning pressed heavily on his mind. They had disturbed something ancient, something powerful, and now the consequences were coming to bear. He glanced at Peter, his heart heavy with guilt. He had tried to warn him, tried to stop him, but Peter had been too stubborn, too proud to listen. The final vision. As the night wore on, Peter's breathing grew more labored, each breath a struggle. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind trapped in a fevered delirium. But even in his weakened state, the visions continued. In the darkness of the room, Peter saw his father standing at the foot of the bed, his face twisted into a grotesque mask of anger. "You brought this on yourself," Michael hissed, his voice cold and unforgiving. "You brought this on all of us." Peter tried to speak, tried to plead for forgiveness, but his voice was gone. All he could do was watch as his father's face loomed closer, his hollow eyes burning with rage. "Now, you'll suffer." The vision faded, leaving Peter gasping for air. His heart raced in his chest, each beat slower than the last. He knew, in that moment, that his time was running out. The curse had claimed him. With one final, shuddering breath, Peter's body went still. The aftermath. The moment Peter died, the house seemed to fall into a deep, oppressive silence. The wind outside had stopped, the air thick with the weight of loss. John stood beside the bed, his eyes locked on his brother's lifeless form. The room was cold, too cold for the time of year, and as John stared at Peter's pale face, he felt a chill crawl up his spine. Michael turned away from the bed, his shoulders sagging with the weight of grief. He had lost his son first to his own pride, and now to something far darker. Outside the window, the single surviving duck stood near the barn, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. It watched the house with an unnerving stillness, as if it knew what had just transpired. The curse had claimed its first victim. The shadow of the curse. In the days that followed, the family was consumed by grief. Peter's death weighed heavily on them all, but it wasn't just the loss of a loved one that haunted them. There was something darker at play, something that went beyond the natural world. The night after Peter's funeral, the shadow returned. John saw it from his bedroom window, gliding silently along the edge of the field, just as his father had described. It lingered for a moment, its shape vaguely human but twisted, its movements unnatural. And then it was gone, swallowed by the night. The family knew now that the curse was real. Peter's death was the first undeniable proof that they had disturbed something that should have been left alone. The land had been violated, and now it was taking its revenge. John couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The curse had claimed Peter, but it wasn't finished. The darkness that had been unleashed was growing stronger, spreading its tendrils through the land, through the family. And it wouldn't stop until it had claimed them all. Part 5. The haunting intensifies. The days following Peter's funeral were heavy with sorrow, but the grief that wrapped itself around the family was not natural. It was laced with something darker, something more insidious, a weight that pressed down on their souls like the cold grip of death itself. The funeral had been a quiet, somber affair, attended by close relatives and a few townsfolk who whispered about Peter's sudden illness. The priest, pale and uneasy, had read the final rites, but even he seemed hurried, eager to leave the air of gloom that had settled around the house. The land itself seemed to resist the burial, the earth cold and unyielding as Peter's coffin was lowered into the ground. As the last shovels of dirt were placed atop the grave, John felt the first tremor of dread in his chest. It was not just grief that weighed on him, it was the unmistakable sense that something had followed Peter to the grave, something that had been awoken and was far from finished. The knocking from the coffin. That night, the family gathered for the wake, their faces drawn with exhaustion. The candles flickered in the corners of the room, casting long shadows on the walls. Michael sat at the head of the table, his face gaunt, his eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot. He had barely spoken since Peter's death, retreating into a silence that unnerved everyone around him. John sat across from him, staring blankly at the floor, lost in his own spiraling thoughts. It started as a faint noise so soft that at first no one heard it. A gentle tapping sound, like the distant echo of raindrops on a window pane. But as the minutes passed, the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it became impossible to ignore. John looked up, his brow furrowing. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. His mother, sitting nearby, shook her head, her eyes clouded with grief. Michael didn't respond, staring ahead as though he hadn't heard a thing. But John knew something was wrong. The sound was coming from outside. No, not from outside. From below. He rose from his chair, his heart pounding in his chest as he moved toward the window. He strained to listen, his breath caught in his throat. And then, clear as day, it came again, the knocking, louder now and unmistakable. It was coming from the direction of Peter's grave. John felt his blood turn to ice. The knocking was coming from Peter's coffin. For a moment he stood frozen, his mind racing to rationalize what he had heard. But there was no mistaking the sound. It was steady, rhythmic, like someone inside the coffin was pounding on the wood, demanding to be let out. His stomach twisted in fear, and before he could stop himself, he rushed out the door, stumbling through the darkness toward the graveyard. The night was cold and still, the wind whispering through the trees like the breath of 1,000 lost souls. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the gravestones. When John reached Peter's grave, he stopped dead in his tracks. The freshly turned earth was undisturbed, but the sound of knocking continued, louder now, echoing in the stillness of the night. He fell to his knees, his hands gripping the soil as the fear rose in his throat. "Peter," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Peter, is that you?" The knocking stopped. For a moment there was only silence. But then, a voice soft but filled with accusation cut through the air like a knife. "You should have stopped this," John recoiled, scrambling back from the grave, his heart hammering in his chest. He looked around wildly, but there was no one there. The voice had come from below, from the grave itself. His brother's voice. The ghost appears. That night, John couldn't sleep. The voice haunted him, echoing in his mind over and over again. "You should have stopped this," he tried to push it away, to convince himself that it was his grief, his guilt, playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew better. It wasn't long before Peter's ghost began to appear to him. At first it was subtle. John would catch glimpses of movement in the corner of his eye, only to turn and find nothing there. Or he would hear footsteps echoing down the hallway late at night, when everyone else was asleep. But as the days passed, Peter's presence grew more tangible, more real. One night, as John lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he felt a sudden chill sweep through the room. His breath caught in his throat, and the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. Slowly, he turned his head, and there, standing at the foot of his bed, was Peter. But this wasn't the brother John remembered. Peter's face was pale, his skin drawn tight over his bones. His eyes, once full of life, were hollow and dark, like empty sockets staring out from a decaying skull. His clothes hung loosely on his thin frame, as though he had wasted away in the ground. "John," Peter whispered, his voice low and raspy. "Why didn't you stop this?" John sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. "Peter, I tried," he stammered, his voice shaking. Peter took a step closer, his eyes burning with accusation. You knew the shrine was not to be disturbed, but you let it happen. You let me die." John shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "I didn't know this would happen, Peter. I didn't know." Peter's ghost loomed closer, his presence cold and suffocating. "It's too late now. The curse is on us all. You let this happen, and now it won't stop." With those words, Peter disappeared, fading into the darkness like smoke. But the cold lingered, wrapping itself around John like a shroud. From that night on, Peter's ghost became a constant presence. He appeared in the house, at the construction site, even in the family's dreams. Each time, his message was the same: "You should have stopped this." John felt himself unraveling under the weight of his brother's accusations. He had tried to stop Peter, had tried to warn him about the shrine, but it hadn't been enough, and now the curse had been unleashed. The family falls ill. As the haunting continued, the family began to suffer. It started with Michael. He had always been strong, a man who had worked the land his whole life, but after Peter's death, something in him had broken. He grew pale and thin, his once robust frame wasting away. He spent his days sitting by the window, staring out at the fields with hollow, unseeing eyes. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were filled with fear. "It's coming for us," he whispered to John one evening, his voice barely audible. "It's coming, and there's nothing we can do to stop it." John tried to reassure him, but the truth was he felt the same. The house had grown colder, darker. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the strange occurrences had only intensified. The knocking from Peter's coffin, the footsteps in the halls, the ghostly apparitions each day brought something worse. Michael's health deteriorated rapidly. The fever that had taken Peter now claimed him as well. He began to have the same visions Peter had described, visions of the shrine, of the shadowy figure that lurked at the edge of the field, and, most disturbingly, of Peter himself. One night, Michael woke screaming, his body drenched in sweat. "He's here," he cried, his voice hoarse with terror. "Peter's here." John rushed to his father's side, but it was too late. Michael's body convulsed violently, his eyes rolling back in his head. He gasped for air, his hands clawing at the bedsheets, as if he were fighting off some unseen force. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Michael lay still, his chest no longer rising and falling. His face was twisted in an expression of pure terror, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. He was dead. The curse takes hold. With Michael's death, the curse had claimed its second victim. The house, once full of life and laughter, was now a place of death and despair. The air was thick with grief, and the walls seemed to close in on the remaining family members, suffocating them with the weight of the curse. John could feel it, growing stronger every day. The land had turned against them, and there was no escape. The curse, once set in motion, would not stop until it had consumed them all. At night, John could hear Peter's voice whispering to him from the darkness, "You should have stopped this," but it was too late. The haunting had only just begun. Part 6. Desperate for help. The house had become a mausoleum of cold, suffocating tone, where whispers of the dead reverberated through the walls. John could no longer tell if the shivers running down his spine were from the draft that now haunted every room or from the unseen cold eyes that he constantly felt watching him. His family was gone. First Peter, then Michael, each taken by an unseen force, each death more terrifying than the last. But the worst part wasn't the deaths, it was what came after. The whispers, the shadows, the accusing eyes that stared at him through the dark corners of his mind. Peter's ghost, pale and decaying, hovered at the edge of his vision, never fully there, yet always present. Michael's face, once strong and full of life, was now gaunt and hollow, his mouth twisted into a permanent scowl of accusation. John had tried to ignore the visions at first, convincing himself it was grief playing tricks on his mind, but there was no ignoring them now. The ghosts of his brother and father didn't simply haunt the house, they haunted him. Their voices followed him everywhere, whispering dark things, reminding him of his failure, reminding him that it was his fault. The curse had taken root, and it was feeding on his soul. John could feel the weight of his ancestors pressing down on him, suffocating him with their demands for retribution. He needed help, someone who understood the darkness that had been unleashed, someone who could stop it before it consumed him too. The search for the spiritual master. John had only one option left. He needed to find the spiritual master, the man who had warned them about the shrine before Peter disturbed it. The man who had tried in vain to stop the chain of events that had now spiraled out of control. The road to the spiritual master's home was long and treacherous, winding through dense forests and desolate hills. John traveled alone, his breath visible in the cold air, his heart heavy with fear. The sky overhead was a blanket of grey, oppressive clouds that seemed to reflect the weight of his thoughts. Every gust of wind felt like the cold touch of death itself, brushing against his skin. The journey took hours, but finally, John arrived at the old man's home, a small, weathered cottage at the edge of a dense forest. The air around the house felt thick, as though it carried the weight of ancient knowledge, dark and foreboding. The trees swayed in a wind that John couldn't feel, their leaves whispering secrets that only the spirits could understand. He hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the worn wooden frame. For a moment he thought of turning back, of returning to the cursed house to face whatever awaited him there. But the pull of desperation was stronger, and with a shaky breath, John knocked. The spiritual master's refusal. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the spiritual master standing in the doorway, his dark, sunken eyes narrowing as they settled on John. He didn't need to ask why John had come. He could feel it, the curse that clung to him, the invisible force that weighed on his shoulders like an anchor dragging him into the abyss. "Please," John whispered, his voice breaking. "I need your help." The spiritual master said nothing at first, his gaze seemed piercing through John as though he could see straight into his soul. Finally, he shook his head, his face hard and unmoving. "It's too late," he said, his voice low and heavy. "The spirits are awake now. They are angry. They will not be stopped." John's heart sank. "But you warned us there must be something we can do. You have to help me." The old man stepped back, his hand gripping the edge of the door, as though he was preparing to close it in John's face. I warned you not to disturb the shrine. I told you the land held powerful spirits that had been bound for centuries. You didn't listen. Now they are free. John felt a wave of desperation wash over him. He couldn't go back, not without some kind of hope. My brother, my father, they're dead and their spirits. They won't leave me alone. They blame me for everything. Please, there must be something I can do. The spiritual master's face softened for a moment, but there was no pity in his eyes, only resignation. Their souls are restless because they are trapped between worlds. They have been consumed by the curse and now they seek vengeance. John's voice trembled with barely contained emotion. Vengeance for what? I didn't disturb the shrine, Peter did. Why are they blaming me? The spiritual master let out a slow, heavy breath. The spirits do not care about fairness, about blame. They care only about balance. The disturbance you allowed has shifted that balance, and now the spirits are taking what they are owed. John's hand shook as he stepped closer to the door, his voice a desperate plea. Then tell me how to restore the balance. There must be something I can do, an offering, a ritual, anything. The spiritual master shook his head again, his expression unreadable. There is nothing that can be done. The curse has already taken hold. You cannot bargain with it. The spirits will take what they will with that. He stepped back inside and shut the door, leaving John standing alone in the cold, the weight of those words crushing him. The haunting intensifies. John's walk back to the house felt longer than the journey to the spiritual master's home. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land. Each step felt like a lead weight dragging him closer to a fate he could not escape. There was no help, no way out. The curse was inescapable, a force of nature that had already decided his fate. When John returned home, the house greeted him with the same cold silence that had haunted it since Peter's death. The shadows on the walls seemed longer, darker, and the air was thick with the presence of the dead. The first thing he saw when he stepped inside was Peter. His brother's ghost stood in the corner of the room, his pale, decaying face staring at John with hollow eyes. The sight of him was enough to send a chill down John's spine, but he was too exhausted, too defeated to react with fear. You couldn't even get help. Peter's voice echoed, low and rasping. You failed us again? John staggered back, his heart racing as Peter's figure moved closer, his ghostly form flickering in and out of focus like a candle struggling to stay lit. But the accusation in his voice was clear. This is your fault, John. Peter continued, his face twisted in anger. You should have stopped it. You should have saved us. John's voice trembled as he spoke. I tried to stop you, Peter. I tried to warn you. Peter's lips curled into a mocking smile, but it was the smile of a corpse, unnatural, twisted, filled with malice. Too little, too late. You let the curse take me, and now it's coming for you. Suddenly, the air in the room grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that John could see his breath in front of him. The shadows deepened, stretching across the walls like black tendrils creeping toward him. From the corner of his eye, John saw another figure emerge from the shadows. It was his father. Michael's ghost was worse than Peter's. His body more decayed, his eyes sunken into dark pits that seemed to stare straight into John's soul. His once strong hands were now bony claws, reaching out toward him. John Michael's voice was little more than a rasp, a low growl that sent shivers down John's spine. You failed us. You failed your family. John stumbled backward, his back hitting the wall. The ghosts were closing in on him, their faces twisted in anger and accusation. They were no longer the family he had known. They were something else now, something dark and vengeful, twisted by the curse that had taken them. You should have stopped this, Michael growled, his voice filled with rage. You should have protected us. John closed his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest as their voices echoed around him, filling the room with their anger, their disappointment. The weight of their accusations pressed down on him like a physical force, suffocating him, crushing him. I'm sorry, John whispered, his voice trembling. I'm so sorry. But the ghosts were relentless. Their voices grew louder, overlapping, filling his mind with their demands for retribution. You let us die, Peter hissed, his voice sharp and venomous. You brought this curse upon us, Michael growled, his skeletal fingers reaching for John's throat. John could feel the cold touch of their hands closing in on him, their fingers brushing against his skin, pulling him deeper into the darkness. He struggled to breathe, his chest tightening as their accusations filled the room, filled his mind, leaving no space for anything else. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, The cold air shifted. The pressure on his chest eased, and the ghost stepped back, their eyes still locked onto him with an intensity that chilled him to his core. "We will not rest," Peter whispered, his voice low and haunting. "Not until the balance is restored with that." Both Peter and Michael's spirits faded back into the shadows, leaving John alone in the cold, dark room. But their words lingered, hanging in the air like a curse. The descent into madness. John was a broken man. The constant haunting had drained him of any sense of hope, of any belief that he could escape the curse. Every night the spirits returned, their demands for retribution growing louder, more insistent. He could no longer tell the difference between waking and sleeping. The nightmares followed him no matter where he went. He saw Peter's face in every shadow, heard his father's voice in every whisper of the wind. The house creaked and groaned with the weight of the spirits that now claimed it as their own. John had become a prisoner in his own home, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. The spiritual master's words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder that there was no escape. It's too late. There was no way to stop the curse, no way to undo the damage that had been done. And John knew, deep down, that the spirits were right. He had failed, he had allowed the curse to take root, and now it was devouring everything he held dear. The question wasn't if the curse would take him, it was when. And in the darkness of that cursed house, John could only wait for the inevitable. Part 7. The 49th Day. The air in the house was thick with dread. It clung to the walls like a shadow that refused to be cast away, weighing heavy on everyone inside. John stood by the window, staring out at the gathering storm clouds that loomed on the horizon. The 49th day since Peter's death had arrived, and with it a palpable sense of doom. It was the day the family had dreaded. The day when, according to old traditions, the soul of the departed would either find peace or remain trapped in the world of the living, cursed to wander eternally. But John knew Peter's soul would find no peace. The curse that had taken hold of their family was too strong, too deep, and too angry, and now it was about to reach its peak. The shrine, long since disturbed, had become a focal point for the dark forces that had been awakened. The ground around it had grown restless. In the past few days, small cracks had appeared in the earth, like a festering wound slowly spreading, waiting for the final moment to split wide open. John could feel it, a tension in the air, a tremor beneath his feet, like the earth itself was holding its breath. He turned away from the window and looked at the altar they had set up for the memorial ritual. Candles flickered weakly, their flames struggling against the unnatural cold that had settled over the house. A small offering of food and incense sat in front of Peter's photograph, which seemed to stare back at John with eyes that burned with accusation, just like in his nightmares. John swallowed hard, his throat dry. This was it. This was the day everything would come crashing down. The storm erupts. As the family gathered around the altar, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. It was a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth, vibrating through the walls of the house, making the floorboards creak and groan. John's mother lit the incense, her hands shaking as she whispered prayers under her breath. She was trying to hold on to tradition, trying to find some semblance of control in a situation that had long since spiraled into chaos. But even as the smoke from the incense rose into the air, curling in delicate spirals, the wind outside began to howl. The storm had arrived. The first flash of lightning split the sky in two, illuminating the dark clouds that now churned above the house like a swirling vortex. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and the candles on the altar flickered violently, their flames dancing wildly as though they were being pulled by an unseen force. John's heart raced in his chest. He had been dreading this moment, the moment when the storm would break. The storm that was not born of nature but of something far more malevolent, something far more ancient. The storm was the herald of what was to come, the spirits of his father and brother, restless and angry, rising from their graves to claim what they believed was theirs. Suddenly there was a loud crash of thunder, followed by a gust of wind so strong that it blew open the front door. The candles on the altar went out instantly, plunging the room into darkness. His mother gasped, clutching her chest, while John stood frozen, his eyes wide as he stared at the open door. It was time. The spirits rise. John could feel it before he saw it, the cold, creeping sensation of death closing in around him. The wind outside howled louder, and with it came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps that crunched against the gravel outside the house. John's mother whispered a prayer, but her words were lost in the roar of the storm. The family huddled together, their eyes wide with terror as the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to be coming from every direction at once. And then, through the open door, they appeared. Peter was the first to step inside. His ghostly figure was almost translucent, his pale skin stretched tightly over his bones, his eyes hollow and empty. His clothes were torn and dirty, as though he had just crawled out of the grave. Behind him, Michael followed, his once strong frame now withered and gaunt, his face twisted in an expression of fury. But it wasn't just their appearance that terrified John, it was the way they moved. Slowly, purposefully, their feet barely touching the ground as they floated toward the altar. Their eyes locked on John with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You should have stopped this," Peter whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You should have listened." John took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of their stares, feel the blame that radiated from their ghostly forms. This wasn't just about the shrine. This was about the curse that had been unleashed when Peter had disturbed it. The curse that had claimed Peter, and then Michael, and now it was coming for the rest of them. The ground splits open. As the spirits moved closer to the altar, the ground beneath the house began to tremble. At first it was a slight vibration, but within moments it became a violent shaking that knocked pictures off the walls and sent dishes crashing to the floor. John's mother screamed, grabbing onto the altar for support as the house shook around them. The storm outside raged with renewed fury, the wind screaming like a banshee, and the lightning flashed so brightly it lit up the entire room. But the worst was yet to come. From the spot where the shrine had once stood, the spot where Peter had disturbed the ancient spirits, the ground began to split open. A deep, jagged crack tore through the earth, snaking its way toward the house like a dark, malevolent force. The sound of the earth splitting was deafening, a deep, guttural roar that drowned out everything else. John watched in horror as the crack reached the house, tearing through the floorboards and spreading like wildfire. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur, and from the depths of the crack, an eerie, otherworldly glow began to emerge. It was a dark, ominous light, pulsating with an energy that felt ancient and evil. The ground was no longer solid beneath their feet, it was as though the earth itself had come alive, writhing and twisting, hungry for more. John's heart raced as he realized what was happening. The crack was a doorway, a portal to something far worse than the spirits of Peter and Michael. It was a doorway to the dark force that had been buried beneath the shrine for centuries, waiting for the moment when it could be unleashed. And now, that moment had come. A dark force emerges. From the depths of the crack, a low, guttural growl echoed through the air. It was the sound of something waking up, something that had been sleeping for centuries, but was now wide awake and hungry. The dark glow from the crack intensified, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. And then, slowly, something began to rise from the depths. It was a shape vaguely human, but wrong in every way. Its limbs were too long, its body twisted and contorted, its skin black as night, and dripping with some kind of thick tar-like substance. John's breath caught in his throat as he watched the creature emerge. It was ancient, older than the spirits that had haunted his family. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent fire, and as it rose higher, its massive form casting an oppressive shadow over the room, John felt a wave of pure, unfiltered terror wash over him. This was the source of the curse. This was the darkness that had been buried beneath the shrine, the darkness that had fed on Peter, on Micah, and now on the entire family. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl, and the air grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that frost began to form on the walls and windows. The ground continued to shake, the crack growing wider as the creature clawed its way out, its twisted limbs reaching out toward John and his family. Descent into despair. John's mother fell to her knees, her hands clasped in prayer as she begged for mercy, her voice trembling with fear. But there was no mercy to be found here. The dark force that had risen from the ground was beyond human comprehension, beyond salvation. It was pure evil, a force that sought only destruction. Peter and Michael's spirits hovered nearby, their faces twisted with anger and pain. But even they seemed to cower in the presence of this dark entity, their forms flickering like dying flames in the shadow of its immense power. John could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, suffocating him, crushing him under the weight of its malevolence. There was no escape. The crack in the earth continued to widen, the dark glow pulsating with a rhythm, that felt like the heartbeat of the world itself. The house began to crumble around them. The walls buckled, the roof sagged, and the floorboards splintered under the pressure of the dark force. The very foundation of the house was being pulled apart, dragged into the gaping maw of the crack. John staggered back, his mind racing as the reality of the situation set in. This wasn't just about Peter or Michael anymore. This was about the curse, the dark force that had been unleashed, and the inevitability of its wrath. There was nothing he could do. He had tried to stop it, had tried to seek help, but it was too late. The spirits were angry, the curse was too strong, and now the darkness had come to claim them all. The final collapse. The storm outside reached its peak, the wind howling like the screams of the damned. Lightning struck the ground around the house, setting the nearby trees ablaze. The sky was a swirling mass of black clouds, and the ground trembled as though the earth itself was in agony. John's mother was sobbing, her prayers turning to incoherent cries of despair. As the dark force continued to rise, its twisted form now fully emerged from the crack in the earth. Its eyes glowed with a fiery hatred, and its massive, clawed hands reached out toward the family, hungry for more. The walls of the house groaned under the pressure, and with a deafening crack, the roof finally gave way. Beams and debris rained down on them, and the floor collapsed, the crack in the earth swallowing everything in its path. John felt the ground give way beneath his feet, and for a brief moment he was weightless, suspended in the air as the world around him crumbled. He reached out, grasping for something, anything, but there was nothing to hold on to. The darkness was all-encompassing, pulling him down into the depths of the earth. As he fell, the last thing he saw was the twisted, grinning face of the dark force, its eyes burning with malevolent glee. And then there was nothing but darkness. The shrine had been disturbed, the curse had been unleashed, and now the family was lost, swallowed by the very earth they had once called home. There was no escape from the curse, no redemption, only the cold, suffocating grip of despair. Part 8. John's final struggle. The house was no longer a home, but a tomb filled with shadows, fear, and death. Every corner breathed with the presence of those who once lived within its walls, now twisted into something monstrous, something unrecognizable. The once warm and inviting place had become a prison, where even the air felt thick and suffocating, as if John was inhaling the essence of the curse itself. He could feel the weight of it closing in, pressing down on his chest like the hand of death, tightening its grip with every breath he took. The spirits of his father, Michael, and his brother, Peter, were no longer faint glimpses in the shadows. They were fully formed now, their spectral bodies pale and decaying, their eyes burning with an otherworldly fire. They hovered just at the edge of John's vision, always watching, always waiting. Their presence was constant, a relentless reminder that the curse was alive and growing stronger, feeding off the souls of the dead, and soon it would claim him too. John's heart pounded in his chest, a drumbeat of fear that echoed louder with each passing second. His muscles tensed, his mind racing for a way out. But deep down he knew the truth. There was no escape. The curse had woven itself into the very fabric of his life, and now it was tightening its grip. He had seen his father dragged down, his brother consumed by it, and soon, very soon it would come for him. The inevitable realization. John stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the remnants of his shattered family. His mother had collapsed in a corner, her eyes wide with terror, as she clutched a rosary to her chest, whispering prayers that fell on deaf ears. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, warping and shifting as the very foundation of the house creaked and groaned. The storm outside had only grown worse, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls like the wailing of 1,000 lost souls. Suddenly John felt a coldness creep up his spine. It was the kind of cold that didn't just chill the skin, but sank deep into his bones, gnawing at him from the inside out. He knew what was coming, he could feel them drawing closer, their presence like a weight pressing down on the air itself. His father and brother near. John, a voice whispered, low and menacing, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was Peter's voice, distorted and hollow, echoing through the room like the wind itself had spoken. You can't run from us? John whipped around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing, only shadows shifting along the walls, writhing like dark, living tendrils. John, the voice came again, and this time it was closer. He could feel the breath of it on his neck, icy and unnatural. He stumbled backward, his hands trembling as panic clawed at his chest. He had to get out. He had to escape. the desperate escape. John bolted toward the front door, his feet barely touching the ground as he ran. His heart raced, adrenaline pumping through his veins, pushing him forward with a desperation he had never felt before. He reached the door, his fingers fumbling with the latch, but as he pulled it open, the wind slammed it shut with a deafening bang. "You can't leave us," Peter's voice hissed in his ear. John spun around, gasping for breath, and there they were, Peter and Michael, standing side by side in the middle of the room, their bodies twisted and decayed, their eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. They looked less like men and more like something pulled from the depths of a nightmare, creatures born of the curse. No longer his family, but something far worse. "You can't run," Michael growled, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. "This is your fate." John backed away, his pulse pounding in his ears. His body was screaming at him to run, but his mind knew the truth: there was nowhere to go. He was trapped just like they were, caught in the grip of the curse that had claimed his father, his brother, and now it would claim him. "You should have listened," Peter whispered, his voice soft but filled with venom. "You brought this upon us, John. You let this happen." "No," John gasped, shaking his head. "I didn't. I tried to stop it." But the words felt hollow, even to him. He had tried, yes, but it hadn't been enough. The shrine had been disturbed, the curse unleashed, and now there was no going back. The spirits closed in. Peter and Michael began to move toward him, their ghostly forms gliding across the floor with an eerie grace, their eyes locked onto John with a hunger that made his skin crawl. They were no longer his family, they were something else now, something darker, twisted by the curse that had consumed them. "Join us," John Michael whispered, his voice low and guttural. "It's your turn now." John's back hit the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps as they closed in. The air around him grew colder, the room darkening as their presence sucked the light from the world. "You can't escape," Peter said, his voice barely more than a breath. It's already too late. John could feel the weight of their gaze pressing down on him, the pull of the curse growing stronger with each passing second. He tried to move, but his legs felt like lead, his body frozen in place by the sheer terror that gripped him. He was trapped, just like they had been. There was no escape, no hope, only the cold, dark pull of the curse dragging him down into the same fate that had claimed them. The ground opens. Suddenly, the ground beneath John's feet began to tremble. It was a low rumble at first, barely noticeable, but it quickly grew into a violent shaking that rattled the walls and sent cracks spidering across the floor. John's eyes widened in horror as he looked down, seeing the floor beneath him split open, revealing the dark, yawning chasm of the earth below. The cracks spread rapidly, widening until it was a gaping maw, a black void that seemed to go on forever. From deep within the earth, a cold, dark wind began to rise, pulling at John's clothes, dragging him toward the edge. No, John screamed, scrambling backward, but it was no use. The pull of the chasm was too strong, the force of it dragging him closer, inch by inch. Michael and Peter stood at the edge of the chasm, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. They reached out their hands, their fingers curling like claws as they beckoned him forward. "Join us," John Peter whispered, his voice filled with malice. "It's your time." John shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let the curse take him too, but there was no stopping it. The ground continued to shake, the crack widening beneath him, and with a final, desperate pull, the earth gave way, dragged into darkness. John's scream was lost in the wind as he fell. His body tumbled through the air weightless as the dark void swallowed him whole. The cold wind rushed past him, the sound of it deafening as he plunged deeper and deeper into the darkness. But the fall wasn't the worst part. It was what waited for him at the bottom. As John tumbled through the void, he could feel them, Peter and Michael, reaching for him, their cold, dead hands brushing against his skin, pulling him down. He struggled, kicking and flailing, but it was no use. Their grip was too strong, their hands too cold, too unrelenting. "You can't escape," Michael's voice whispered in his ear, cold and hollow. "You belong to us now." John's breath came in short, ragged gasps as their hands tightened around him, dragging him deeper into the darkness. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, the weight of the curse pressing down on him like a leaden shroud. "No," John whispered, his voice barely audible. "I won't," but it was already too late. With a final, desperate pull, Peter and Michael dragged him down into the earth, their ghostly forms wrapping around him like a shroud of death. The darkness closed in, swallowing him whole, and the last thing John saw, before the void consumed him, was the twisted, grinning faces of his brother and father, their eyes glowing with the light of the curse. The end of the line. The earth sealed itself behind him with a final, echoing crack, the dark void closing over John's head as though he had never existed. The house above stood in silence, the storm having passed, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. But there was no peace here. The curse had claimed another soul, and the darkness that had once been contained beneath the shrine had now spread, creeping through the land like a poison waiting for its next victim. John's struggle had ended, but the curse lived on. And as the spirits of Peter and Michael rose from the ground, their eyes glowing with a malevolent fire, they knew one thing for certain: it wasn't over yet. The curse would never be satisfied. It would take and take until there was nothing left. And as the wind howled through the empty house, the spirits of the dead waited, hungry for more. Part 9. The curse completes. The dawn broke quietly over the village, casting soft, golden light across the rolling fields. Birds chirped in the trees, unaware of the darkness that had unfolded mere hours before. The village, usually peaceful in the early morning, now felt eerie and tense, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something unspeakable to be revealed. In the distance, smoke from the chimneys of nearby homes curled lazily into the sky. Life, it seemed, was going on as normal. Yet something was wrong. The villagers felt it. A palpable sense of dread hung over the area like a shroud, thick and suffocating. It wasn't long before the first villager wandered near John's family home. The house had stood on the edge of the village for generations, a proud and sturdy structure, though it had become a place of whispers and fear after the recent deaths. No one ventured near it unless absolutely necessary. But this morning was different. There had been strange noises during the night, odd disturbances that had set the animals on edge. Some claimed they heard screams carried by the wind, though no one dared to investigate while a storm raged. One of the older villagers, a man named Dean, approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the house and the yard for any sign of life. The shutters on the windows hung crooked, swaying gently in the breeze, and the front door was left ajar, creaking with each passing gust of wind. It was unsettling, as though the house itself was breathing. Dean hesitated at the gate, his gut twisting with unease. Something wasn't right. His instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave the cursed place alone. But curiosity, or perhaps some deeper, inexplicable pull drove him forward. The discovery. As Dean stepped closer to the yard, the smell hit him first, a foul stench, like something rotting in the heat. It clung to the air, thick and nauseating, and he instinctively raised a hand to his nose. His heart quickened, and his mouth went dry as he forced himself to continue, drawn toward the center of the yard. And then he saw it. John's body lay sprawled in the dirt, his limbs twisted unnaturally, as though he had fought something invisible, something impossible, before finally succumbing. His face was frozen in a grotesque expression of terror, his mouth open in a silent scream, his eyes wide and glassy, staring at nothing but the horror of his last moments. Dean stumbled back, his legs trembling beneath him. His mind refused to comprehend the sight before him, the sheer wrongness of it all. He had seen death before, but this was something else. It was as if the very life had been sucked out of John, leaving only an empty shell, a body drained of its soul. The villagers soon gathered at the edge of the yard, their voices hushed and fearful as they whispered among themselves. No one dared to cross the threshold of the cursed land. Even the bravest among them, those who might have stepped forward in other circumstances, stood frozen, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the realization that the curse had finally claimed its last victim. The shrine's dark secret. As the villagers whispered, some glanced toward the far end of the yard where the shrine had once stood. To their astonishment, the ground around it was untouched, pristine as though nothing had ever happened. The earth was smooth, undisturbed, as if no one had ever torn into it to move the shrine, as if the spirits had never been awakened. There was no sign of the terrible events that had unfolded there, no crack in the earth, no dark force rising from below. Only the memory of what had been, and the bodies left in its wake. One villager, an elderly woman known for her knowledge of old folklore, shook her head as she stared at the untouched ground. The curse is complete, she murmured, her voice low and trembling. It has taken what it wanted. Her words sent a chill through the gathered crowd. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, their fear growing with each passing second. They had heard stories of such curses before, passed down through the generations, curses tied to forgotten shrines, to restless spirits that demanded retribution. But no one had ever truly believed them, not until now. The villagers knew deep down that there was nothing they could do. The curse had run its course. It had claimed its victims one by one, and now it was over. All that remained were the echoes of the horrors that had befallen John's family, and the knowledge that something dark and ancient still lingered beneath the earth, waiting for its next opportunity to rise. Whispers of horror. Days passed and the village returned to its quiet routine, though the shadow of the curse still hung over it like a dark cloud. No one spoke openly of what had happened to John and his family, but the whispers spread like wildfire. Late at night, as the winds rustled through the trees and the moon cast airy shadows on the ground, the villagers would tell the tale of the cursed shrine and the family that had dared to disturb it. They spoke of the strange, unnatural deaths, the way Peter had fallen ill, haunted by visions of his father's accusing face, the way Michael had died in the same horrific manner, his body twisted and broken as though he had been dragged down by invisible hands. And finally they spoke of John, the last to fall, his face frozen in terror as the spirits claimed him. But it was more than just a story. The villagers could feel it, a lingering presence that clung to the land, to the house where John's family had lived. Some said they could still hear the faint whispers of the dead, carried on the wind late at night. Others claimed they saw shadows moving in the windows of the abandoned house, flickering for just a moment before disappearing into the darkness. And always there was the shrine. The villagers avoided it, even in the daylight. Children were warned to stay away, and the elderly shook their heads whenever it was mentioned. They knew the truth: the curse may have taken its last victim, but the darkness it had unleashed would never truly be gone. A final warning: the village elder, who had seen more than her fair share of strange and terrible things, called a meeting one evening. She gathered the villagers around the fire, her weathered face lit by the flickering flames. Her voice was low and serious as she spoke, the crackle of the fire the only sound that punctuated her words. This curse, this darkness. She began, it is not something that can be undone. We cannot simply bury it and forget. The shrine was disturbed, the spirits were awakened, and now they have taken what they came for. But we must remember. The villagers listened in silence, their faces drawn with fear and uncertainty. We must not forget what happened here, the elder continued. We must respect the old ways, the old shrines, the old spirits. There are things in this world we do not understand, forces older and more powerful than we can imagine. And when we disturb them, we invite their wrath. She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd, making sure her words had sunk in. The ground may seem quiet now, but it remembers. The curse may have claimed its last victim, but it is never truly over. It waits, watching, biding its time. The House of Shadows. John's family home was never touched again. It stood empty, abandoned by the village, left to crumble and decay over time. Weeds grew tall in the yard, the windows became caked with dirt, and the front door, once slammed shut by the winds of the curse, remained forever closed. The house became a symbol of the horror that had taken place, a dark reminder to the villagers of the price that was paid for disturbing the ancient spirits. Some brave souls, mostly teenagers daring each other on moonless nights, would venture close to the house. They would press their faces against the grimy windows and swear they saw movement inside, shadows flickering just out of sight, dark shapes lurking in the corners. But no one ever stayed long. The air around the house felt too heavy, too thick with the presence of the dead. Over the years, the house became known as the House of Shadows. It was said that the spirits of John, Peter, and Michael still roamed its halls, trapped there by the curse that had taken them. Some nights, villagers claimed they could hear John's final scream carried on the wind, a sound so filled with terror that it sent shivers down their spines. But no one dared to venture inside, not after what had happened. The final silence. Years passed, and the memory of the cursed family slowly faded from the minds of the villagers. New generations came and went, and with them, the tale of the shrine became little more than a cautionary ghost story, something to tell children to keep them from wandering too far at night. But the shrine remained, untouched and undisturbed, a silent guardian over the dark secrets buried beneath the earth. The village elder's warning was not forgotten by all. There were still those who, on quiet nights, would glance toward the abandoned house and feel the chill of the curse still lingering in the air. And though the whispers of the curse had quieted, there was always the unsettling sense that it was not truly gone. The spirits, though satisfied for now, were still watching, still waiting for the day someone would disturb them again. And when that day came, the curse would return, more vengeful than ever. In the stillness of the village, beneath the calm surface of life, the curse completed its cycle, but it never truly ended. It merely slept, waiting for the next soul to awaken it.